The fence line was barely visible under blackberry brambles the day Elena Brandt first walked the property. 45 acres in Oregon's Willamette Valley, the pasture gone to thistle, the old farmhouse's roofline sagging on one corner, a barn nobody had used for anything but storing junk in over a decade. The real estate listing had called it an opportunity for the right buyer. Most of the farmers who'd toured it before Elena had called it something closer to a mistake waiting to happen. Elena bought it anyway. 1 year later, buyers from 4 different restaurants were driving out to that same property to pick up crates of garlic Elena had grown on 11 of those 45 acres. Garlic that sold out faster than she could dig it, on soil everyone in the valley had assumed was finished. Nobody who watched her sign that purchase agreement could have told you exactly how she got from one moment to the other. Not yet. If you believe in second chances for land that everyone else gave up on, subscribe to this channel. Tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to know how far this story travels. Elena was 41 years old when she bought the property. A former restaurant manager who'd spent nearly 15 years working the front and back of house at a handful of well-regarded farm-to-table restaurants in Portland, before deciding, somewhat abruptly to the people who knew her, that she wanted to be on the growing end of that supply chain instead of the plating end. She wasn't a farmer by upbringing. Her only real agricultural background was a handful of seasons volunteering on a friend's small vegetable operation and an obsessive habit of asking every farmer she'd ever bought from exactly how they grew, what they grew. What she did have, from all those years in professional kitchens, was an unusually precise understanding of what chefs actually wanted, what they'd pay a premium for, and how thin the margin usually was between a crop that moved easily through a restaurant's kitchen and one that sat unsold in a walk-in cooler. The 45 acres came up for sale after its previous owner, an elderly man who'd farmed it alone for the better part of 2 decades after his wife passed, finally moved into assisted living. Nobody in his family wanted to take on the property, and the years of declining physical ability before his move had left the land in the kind of condition that scared off most conventional buyers. Overgrown fencing, an outdated irrigation system, pasture that hadn't been properly managed in years, and soil that a couple of prospective buyers' agronomists had dismissed after a quick visual assessment as worked out. Elena bought it for a price low enough that even with her modest savings and a conservative loan, she could afford both the land and a reasonable first-year operating budget. She understood, walking the property that first week, that she wasn't buying a finished farm. She was buying potential nobody else had bothered to test. The condition of the land, once she actually started working it that first fall, was worse in some ways and better in others than she'd expected. The blackberry brambles along the fence lines had to come out first, an exhausting weeks-long process of cutting, pulling roots, and repeating the process as new canes kept sprouting from root fragments left behind. Sections of the old woven wire fencing had rusted through completely, requiring full replacement before she could responsibly bring in any livestock, though livestock wasn't part of her first-year plan anyway. The irrigation system, an aging system of above-ground lines and a single well pump, needed enough repair that Elena spent a genuinely uncomfortable portion of her remaining budget just getting water reliably moving across even a portion of the property. But the soil itself, when she finally had it properly tested that October, told a more complicated story than the worked-out label a previous buyer's agronomist had casually applied. Elena hired an independent soil consultant recommended by a former restaurant supplier, rather than relying on second-hand assumptions from people who'd only walked the property once. The consultant took samples from 6 different zones across the property and sent them for full lab analysis. The results, which came back 3 weeks later, showed something Elena hadn't expected. Organic matter across most of the property was indeed low, likely the result of years of hay production without adequate soil amendment. But the pH sat in a comfortable, workable range, and critically, one particular section, roughly 12 acres on a gentle south-facing slope with naturally good drainage, showed considerably healthier structure than the rest of the property, likely because it had been used for pasture rotation rather than continuous hay cutting in the previous owner's final working years. The consultant explained it plainly. The farm wasn't uniformly depleted, it was unevenly managed, which was a very different and considerably more workable problem. Some sections needed serious rebuilding. One section, properly prepared, could likely support a demanding crop in its very first season. That distinction became the foundation of Elena's entire first-year plan. Choosing what to actually plant took Elena most of that fall, weighing her options against everything she understood from her restaurant years. She ruled out several crops relatively quickly. Row vegetables required more labor and irrigation infrastructure than her budget and repaired system could reliably support in year one. A larger orchard crop would take years before producing any meaningful income at all, which her financing timeline simply didn't allow for. What kept coming back to her, the more she researched, was hardneck garlic, a crop well suited to the Willamette Valley's climate, requiring a fall planting and a midsummer harvest that fit neatly inside her available first year. And, critically, a crop she knew from her restaurant experience that quality-focused chefs consistently struggled to source enough of locally. Most garlic on the wholesale market came from large-scale operations selling a uniform, storage-bred variety. Fresh, flavorful hardneck varieties, sold directly to chefs who cared about the difference, commanded prices several times higher than commodity garlic, often enough to make even a modest planted acreage genuinely profitable. It wasn't a crop without risk. Garlic required well-drained soil to avoid rot, careful curing after harvest, and enough hand labor for planting and harvesting that Elena knew she'd be working long days largely alone. But it matched her soil, her timeline, and her market knowledge better than any other option she seriously considered. She planted her first crop across 11 of the 12 acres the soil consultant had flagged as her strongest ground, using several different hardneck varieties to spread her risk and give restaurant buyers some variety to choose from. The planting itself, that November, was more physically demanding than Elena had fully appreciated going into it. Hand-separating and planting individual garlic cloves across 11 acres, even with a small mechanical planter she'd rented for part of the work, took her the better part of 3 exhausting weeks, working from first light most mornings until she genuinely couldn't see well enough to continue. The first real setback arrived that December, when an unusually wet stretch of Pacific Northwest winter rain settled over the valley for nearly a month straight. 2 lower sections of her planted acreage, areas the soil test hadn't flagged as problematic, but that turned out to sit slightly lower than the surrounding ground, began showing standing water after the heaviest rain events. Garlic cloves sitting in saturated soil for extended periods are highly vulnerable to rot before they ever properly establish. Elena lost a meaningful portion of her planting in those 2 low sections, she estimated, once she could finally assess the damage that following spring, somewhere close to 15% of her total planted crop. It was a genuinely discouraging setback, arriving early enough in the process that Elena admitted, looking back on it later, that she seriously questioned whether she'd misjudged the entire plan. The adaptation came from something she'd actually learned during her original soil investigation, information she hadn't fully appreciated the importance of until the flooding forced her to look at it again. Her soil consultant had mentioned, almost in passing during that first assessment, that the property's original farmer had installed a partial agricultural drainage tile system decades earlier, old clay drainage pipe buried beneath sections of the lower fields to help manage exactly this kind of seasonal water accumulation. Much of it had likely degraded or become blocked with disuse over the years, but Elena, digging through the elderly former owner's old farm records that she'd been given as part of the property sale, found a hand-drawn map showing roughly where that old tile system ran. She hired a local drainage contractor that spring to inspect and partially restore 2 runs of the old tile system beneath her lowest, worst-affected planting area. A real but manageable expense, given how much of the crop she stood to lose otherwise. It wasn't a complete fix, and it came too late to save what she'd already lost that winter. But it meaningfully reduced standing water in that section going forward, protecting the portion of her crop that had survived and giving her real information for how she'd plan future plantings on that same ground. Through the spring, the surviving crop, particularly across the higher, better-drained portion of her planting, developed steadily. Elena spent those months on the unglamorous, essential work of garlic production, hand-weeding rows that couldn't tolerate significant competition, monitoring for early signs of fungal pressure common in the valley's damp spring conditions, and adjusting her irrigation schedule as the plants moved through their growth stages toward the bulb development that would ultimately determine her harvest. A second, smaller setback arrived in May, when an unseasonably warm stretch brought early pressure from onion thrips, a common pest for allium crops that can meaningfully reduce bulb size if left unmanaged. Elena, working from guidance she got through a call to the regional extension office, implemented a targeted organic-approved treatment and adjusted her irrigation timing to reduce the dusty conditions the pests favored. The intervention worked reasonably well, though she still expected, going into harvest, that her yields would come in somewhat below the optimistic end of what she'd initially projected. Harvest began in early July, timed carefully around the point when the lower leaves on the garlic plants had died back appropriately, without waiting so long that the bulbs began splitting in the ground. A timing window experienced growers learned to read carefully, and one Elena had spent considerable effort researching and monitoring for that first uncertain year. She hand-harvested across her surviving acreage over roughly 10 days, carefully lifting bulbs to avoid bruising, then moving them into a curing setup she'd built in her repaired barn. A simple system of hanging racks and fans to properly dry the bulbs before they'd be ready for sale. A process that would take several more weeks before the crop was truly market-ready. The final numbers, once she'd fully cured and graded the harvest that August, came in better than her cautious post-flooding expectations, though not quite at the optimistic projections she'd made before losing that first section to standing water. Her surviving planting yielded an average of just over 800 pounds of marketable garlic per acre across the roughly 9.5 acres that had made it through both setbacks in reasonable condition. A solid, if not exceptional, result for a first-year planting on ground with an inconsistent management history. What made the real difference wasn't simply the yield. It was the market she'd built for it before the harvest ever came out of the ground. Elena had spent the winter and spring, alongside her fieldwork, reaching back out to chefs and restaurant buyers she'd known during her years in Portland's food industry, letting them know what she was growing and roughly when it would be ready. By the time harvest arrived, she had standing interest from 4 different restaurants specifically requesting her Hardneck varieties, along with a modest but steady presence at a well-attended Saturday farmers market in a nearby town. The restaurant buyers, once they received their first deliveries, paid noticeably more than wholesale commodity garlic pricing, the kind of premium Elena had anticipated from her years watching what chefs were willing to pay for genuinely fresh, flavorful product with a known local source. Between her restaurant accounts and farmers market sales, Elena moved through her entire harvest within about 6 weeks of curing completion, faster than she'd optimistically projected, with 2 of her restaurant buyers already asking to lock in a larger standing order for the following season before she'd even finished that first year's sales. Total revenue from that first 11-acre planting, after accounting for her seed stock, labor, and the drainage repair expense, came to a modest but genuinely meaningful figure, enough to cover her operating costs for the year, begin repaying a portion of her initial loan ahead of schedule, and leave her with real capital to expand her planted acreage the following season onto additional ground she now understood considerably better than she had that first uncertain fall. The reaction around the valley was quieter than dramatic, the way these things usually are among people who watch each other's operations closely, without saying much directly. A neighboring farmer who'd told Elena outright the year she bought the property that she was taking on more than she could handle, stopped by that September and asked, without much preamble, how her drainage repair had actually worked out, clearly considering something similar for a low section of his own ground. A local food writer, hearing about Elena's restaurant accounts through one of the chefs she supplied, wrote a short feature on the transformation for a regional publication, focusing less on the sales numbers and more on the unglamorous, patient work of properly assessing what a piece of neglected land could actually support. Elena is careful, when people ask her directly, not to oversell what happened that year. She'll tell you plainly that the property's other sections, the parts her soil consultant had flagged as genuinely depleted, still needed years of careful rebuilding before they'd support anything close to what her strongest 12 acres had managed in year 1. She'll tell you the drainage problem could have been considerably worse if she hadn't happened to find that old hand-drawn map in a box of the previous owner's records. And she's quick to say the same crop, planted with the same effort, wouldn't necessarily succeed the same way on different soil, in a different climate, without the same kind of local restaurant market she'd spent 15 years building relationships within before she ever planted a single clove. What she'll tell you the farm actually taught her if you ask, isn't really about garlic at all. It's that a piece of land's neglected condition doesn't automatically tell you its actual potential, but figuring out the difference takes real investigation, not assumption, and even then, success still depends on choosing something suited to both the ground beneath your feet and the market willing to pay for what you're able to grow there. The blackberry brambles are gone from the fence lines now, replaced by neat rows extending across a farm that, 1 year earlier, almost nobody believed was worth the trouble.